So, Mary, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Before we dive down into the topic of 5G network slicing and what the specific security challenges are there, let's start out at a little higher level. I think that cyber attacks in the industry are increasing and becoming more headline news. It seems that the regularity at which they're occurring is increasing. What do you see as being the reason for that?
Yes, it seems like every time I turn on the news, there's news about a cyber attack. And at Nokia, we monitor threats, and we do our own threat intelligence. And if we had to say one thing about 2021, it would be the year of supply chain attacks. So what we're seeing are bad actors who, rather than attacking one company, will attack a supply chain. So we saw that with SolarWinds, which is a very popular network management application. And, attackers went through a back door, and by attacking SolarWinds, and they were able to get access to, I think, 18,000 other companies. And so you're seeing a proliferation of attacks, at a much bigger number because of these supply chain attacks. The other thing that we've seen is ransomware as a service. So, we as equipment vendors or service providers, we talk about software as a service. Well, the bad guys are there with ransomware as a service. And so we saw an attack on a US power company using technology from ransomware as a service, right? So that's helped with the proliferation of malware. And the other thing we've seen is a huge increase over last year and this year in terms of IoT infections. So having IoT devices out there that have vulnerabilities, some of them, have been forgotten about or not managed or not upgraded. So we've seen a huge increase in infections in IoT devices. And then on top of that, you add in COVID. And especially last year, we saw, and we continue to see this year, phishing attacks related to COVID information to try and, trick people into clicking an email and installing, malware on their machines, infecting their computers. And we also, because of COVID and people working from home, we saw greater infections in terms of residential home telecommunications equipment. So now some of the COVID stuff is improving because we've got companies that are helping employees secure, their homes and their residentials. And because of the media and the publicity, a lot of people are getting educated on phishing and email. So we're seeing improvement in that area. But because of those key developments, we're seeing more and more cyber attacks, right? Driven by the bad guys for their motivations, whether it's nation state or for money or whatever drives them. So.
Mm-hmm. It seems really interesting, the IoT scenario that you mentioned there. I was reading a story recently about CCTV cameras and being connected devices now. And, as you say, they're forgotten devices that are connected to a central network, and they're just entry points for malware. And
Yeah.
It seems that as we proliferate IoT devices, this could probably get worse.
Yes. We saw a huge increase last year, like 100% increase in terms of IoT infections. One of the things that Nokia does, and we provide solutions, so we can do network-based malware detection. So it can enable the service providers to detect if an IoT device that is connecting to their network or a phone that has malware on it. It can tell them the type of malware, which devices accessing the network are infected, so they can actually take action against those infected devices, or offer a service to tell companies, for example, or individual subscribers their phone is infected or these IoT devices are infected. So there is technology out there to combat this. And one of the other key areas is, we have people doing in the industry, people are doing penetration testing against these devices, but the bad guys are moving equally as fast, right, in exploiting these vulnerabilities. So it's one thing about security is there's something new happening every single day. So
Well,
if you want to be in an
security.
industry where you learn something new every day, security is it.
Security seems like a much more business critical concern than it was in the 3G and 4G eras. So how would you describe security and its place in the modern CSP, and in particular, what we see this role of the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO, and SecOps teams. So for an audience who are not familiar with these terms, could you give us a brief outline of what's meant by that?
Yeah. So, in terms of past networks or 3G networks, and they were a lot easier to protect. You put your firewalls around it. It was, pretty well walled protection. But as we move forward with new technology, and especially with 5G, where you have a distributed network, and that distributed network enables Industry 4.0 and in future billions of IoT devices connected to it. In security terms, you have a much bigger expanded attack surface. So if you looked at 3G or 4G, the attack surface was less. The number of entry points a bad actor could get into your network was smaller. With 5G, it's explosive. You have a huge expanded attack surface. And so that brings in new security challenges that have to be designed in from day one, the solutions to those security challenges. In terms of CSOs, I talked to a lot of CSOs, and, I talked to one recently, and it was just like, they described it as just attack after attack coming in. So just being bombarded with attacks all the time, right? And the only way you can deal with that is through automation, right? Automation, machine learning, extreme automation in a sense, right? And some of these attacks are new, you haven't seen them before, but make no mistake about it, in 3G, 4G, networks were attacked, right? We heard less about it, but I think the last TMF conference, I spoke about security, the last one in person, and I described an advanced persistent threat on a service provider where their network had been hacked and held for ransomware. And I can remember thinking afterwards, wow, I scared this audience. They didn't realize service providers were being hacked. And I thought, wow, I hope I didn't scare them too much. And now it's 2021. And of course, you read about it in the press of service providers being hacked, right? So, but in 2000, I would say 19, it was a lot less visible, but it was still happening, right? Service provider networks were being attacked and they were being held for ransomware. Fortunately, most of them handled that really well, so it never made the press, right? So
Interesting that it's picking up at such a rate. So, in the context of 5G, how is this impacting 5G, and what do operators need in their IT ecosystems to protect new 5G services end to end?
Yeah. So in terms of 5G, we talk about service orchestration, we talk about intent-based service orchestration, defining a service, and there are TMF APIs for how you define a service and how you do digital operations, and we talk about slicing. And so when we design a slice, when we deploy a slice. I would say we design a slice, we secure a slice, then we deploy a slice. And you have to think about, when we talk about service orchestration, a lot of times we talk about silos. We look at service orchestration and solutions for service orchestrations versus security orchestration. And security orchestration is equally important. And it's the intersection of, okay, when I deploy a service and I design a service and I secure that, I think about how I'm going to secure that services, what attributes are around those service from a security perspective, and then I deploy that service and I assure that service. And then essentially you have to use machine learning and intelligence. And intelligence, you can use fault management and performance management and intelligence about how that network or that slice is performing, but you also need to combine that with threat intelligence to understand what are the threats that are happening against that network or that service. And that drives as well security orchestration, so that your security orchestrator can take the appropriate actions to secure that. So if there's something abnormal happening in the network, if a CNF or VNF is not performing properly or acting abnormally, or we're looking at the threats that are happening on the network, the intersection of service orchestration and security orchestration, to me, is where the real value is. And I think before we often thought about security as an afterthought or secondary, but I think you have to think about security orchestration and service orchestration at the same time. And I think you get the real benefits when you automate across domains instead of thinking of them as two separate domains.
Mm-hmm. As a person who talks about OSS, BSS, and network all day, every day, I don't consider myself to be an expert on security, and I kind of think that in the past it's always been something that's adjunct to your internal IT ecosystem, and it's something separate. And if I'm hearing you right, I think you're saying that the new attitude to security is that it's kind of baked into all of these internal systems, and it's kind of a primary concern when you're building new software solutions.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we talked about operators securing their own networks, but there seems to be a trend towards operators monetizing security as a service. I know this is something that Nokia are heavily involved in. Can you give us a little flavor on how that works?
Yeah. So service providers spend enormous amounts of money securing their own network, right? So, for example, if they're doing network-based malware detection, a lot of times they deploy that functionality or those products to protect their own network, right? To prevent attacks that are happening, or denial of service attacks. So they're investing heavily in security, and they're experts in security. And so why not make use of that investment? So why not monetize that investment? Service providers have the security expertise, they've invested in security, and they're trusted. They tend to be trusted partners that are there. So if I'm an enterprise and I'm looking to buy a managed security service, I can look to my service provider. And where I talked about where they have malware detection, they can take that just as one example and monetize it. So they could offer a service to an enterprise that says, okay, plus, they manage IoT devices. They could offer a smart city service that has enhanced security. They could offer the service that says, okay, we can tell you, because we know and we have this information, we can tell you if any of these IoT devices are infected. Those cameras that you talked about earlier, we can tell if they're infected, from the network. So they have this data that they can then use to offer security services. We are working with one customer who wants to be known as the dominant security provider in their region, right? So I think we're going to see more and more of this. And, a lot of them offer security services today, but I think that's a growing market for the service providers.
Well, we've just finished quite a large research project in our benchmark reports, and identifying growth for operators in the security segment was one of the highest growth areas for kind of new revenues for operators. So it's interesting that it's growing at a rate slightly quicker than IoT and all of those kind of things that we usually think about as high growth areas. So it's certainly something that's we've defined as a big opportunity for operators.
It's a huge opportunity. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I'd like to give you opportunity to talk a bit more about Nokia's security program. What kind of makes it special for 5G service providers? What sets it apart?
So I joined Nokia about 5 years ago through an acquisition. I was a CEO of a security company, and when I joined Nokia, I was amazed at the security knowledge, and the real differentiator that Nokia has is it understands networks, it understands fixed networks, it understands mobile networks, and we have people that understand security. And so having that in-depth mobile and network knowledge combined with the network security knowledge gives Nokia a real security advantage. And so some of the things we're doing is because we understand, how mobile networks really work. For 5G, we're offering, extended detection and response. We're using that technology, but we define use cases that are specifically for mobile networks. So for example, you can visualize a 5G network. So, on your SOC or your security operations center, you can visualize your 5G network. You can see the RAN, the transport, and the core parts of your network. And on that, we will overlay a threat index. So you can see the threats that are occurring on your mobile network. And we do that using machine learning, by using our own threat intelligence to power that. And that is really powerful. And we're rolling this out. We call it NetGuard Cyberdome. And you can see the Cyberdome terminology because the CSOs, as I mentioned before, they're getting bombarded with attacks, right? So what we're helping customers do is visualize the threats on their network. And it's really important to understand where the threats are. And the real value is to be proactive and go out and threat hunt as opposed to waiting for an attack to occur. And then not only do we help them visualize the threats on their 5G network, but also be able to take action to automate dealing with those threats. So if you have to, shut things down or change configuration, we help do that automatically. So that's we have many use cases, but the differentiator for Nokia, because there's thousands and thousands of security companies out there, our differentiation and where we invest is we invest specifically for security solutions targeted for service providers based on our knowledge of security and networking. So that's what we're doing.
Great. I'm aware that we've run out of time today, but
Okay.
Many thanks for your thoughts and your insights on security today, Mary, and many thanks to the audience for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.